U.S. foreign policy, especially when you're talking about a country like Iran, well, it often feels like navigating constantly shifting sands, doesn't it?
It really does. Like
Very
trying to find solid ground that keeps moving.
exactly. And today we're doing a deep dive into, I think, a really critical question. How do the stances of powerful leaders actually evolve? Or, maybe more interestingly, how do they seem to evolve over time?
It's a fascinating puzzle. And our main focus for this deep dive is the former president, Donald Trump. We're going to try and unpack his, well, pretty surprising pivot.
Right, from being this vocal anti-war
Yeah,
voice.
to suddenly issuing this stark, unconditional surrender warning aimed squarely at Iran. What makes it compelling, I think, is digging into the layers of that apparent change.
And looking at the dissent that popped up even within his own circle.
Absolutely. And maybe shining a light on those powerful, often kind of hidden forces at play in Washington, the ones you don't always see.
For sure. And look, there's so much noise around this topic. So our mission here for you listening is to really try and cut through that.
We've gathered a whole stack of sources, interviews, tweets, news reports, even direct intelligence assessments.
So the promise is we'll lay it all out, give you a comprehensive view so you can get a clear picture of what's genuinely happening, and importantly, why it might matter to you.
Okay, let's jump in.
So to really get this shift, we kind of have to rewind. Go back to Trump's historical position. If you think back to his 2016 campaign,
Oh, yeah. He was definitely the anti-war firebrand then.
totally, giving these what people called long speeches against war, he was openly criticizing the war lobby, saying point blank the U.S. gained nothing from wars like Iraq.
Nothing. And that the U.S. was, quote, ruined. Remember that. Needed to make America great again by, well, stopping these wars.
And it wasn't just rhetoric, was it? He was pretty consistent. There was that 2015 Guardian interview.
Right, where he basically argued removing Saddam Hussein didn't help. He called Iraq destroyed and effectively occupied by Iran and ISIS afterwards.
And he linked it to the debt, didn't he?
Yeah, the $19 trillion debt. Said the U.S. should focus on building its own country, not nation building somewhere else. His message back then, pretty clear, pretty unwavering.
And he doubled down on that. Later that year, CNN interview saying Libya, Iraq, the Middle East, all destroyed.
He even made that controversial point that things were maybe better with leaders like Gaddafi and Saddam in power.
Despite calling Saddam a horrible guy, he pointed out, okay, Iraq had no terrorism then, but became a Harvard for terrorists after he was gone. That was his framing.
It really highlights his focus then on, let's say, the unintended consequences of intervention. And he didn't just focus on Iraq or Libya.
No, Syria too. Criticizing the Obama administration, the billions of dollars spent on, what was it, rebels we know nothing about?
Exactly. So for like a decade, this was his brand. Opposing foreign intervention, wasting taxpayer money. What happens elsewhere isn't really America's business. He was the guy coming in to end wars, not start them.
That's such a strong, consistent message over years, which makes the pivot even more jarring because then, almost like overnight,
Yeah, it felt very sudden.
between June 13th and 17th, boom, this unconditional surrender warning to Iran just appears. From your look at the sources, what do you think triggered such a, well, such a whiplash moment?
It's a huge turn, no doubt. And the immediate take from a lot of observers, as you'd expect, is that Trump himself has kind of surrendered. Surrendered to that very lobby he swore he'd fight.
The irony is thick there.
It is. And his language, apparently on the flight back from Canada, was really aggressive. He said flat out he wasn't looking for a ceasefire. He wanted an end, a definitive end, to Iran's nuclear program.
And he brushed off any dissent.
Completely. Said he doesn't care what Tulsi Gabbard thinks about it. And then that tweet, June 17th, was pretty stark.
Read it again because the wording is something else.
We know exactly where the so-called supreme leader is hiding. He's an easy target, but he's safe where he is, at least for now. But we don't want missiles targeting civilians or American soldiers. Our patience is running out. Thank you for your attention on this matter.
Wow. I mean, that language, it feels like such a departure, like moving towards, as some people put it, a world turning into a militia.
Where maybe the normal rules, laws, ethics,
Yeah.
they just start to blur or maybe don't apply.
It really makes you wonder about the pressures involved, doesn't it? What happens behind closed doors?
Definitely. And this whole shift, it didn't exactly happen in a vacuum.
No, it immediately started showing these deep cracks, these fissures within what used to look like a pretty solid anti-war group among his own supporters.
Right. We're talking some big names here.
Yeah.
People who are usually aligned with his anti-intervention stance.
Like Tucker Carlson, Steve Bannon, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Alex Jones, Matt Gaetz.
Tulsi Gabbard, obviously. J.D. Vance, Thomas Massey, Ro Khanna even. Folks who'd publicly been against military action, and they weren't staying quiet.
Tucker Carlson really seemed to take a leading role in pushing back, didn't he?
He did. He was very open about opposing an attack on Iran, and he kept reminding Trump publicly about his own past anti-war statements. Like, hey, remember this.
And that interview with Ted Cruz was quite something.
Oh, yeah, where Carlson basically grilled Cruz on, like, basic facts about Iran. Population size,
Sure.
ethnic groups. And Cruz kind of had to admit he didn't know.
Which led to Carlson's really pointed question.
You want to drop bombs on a country whose population you don't even know? Boof. And he drove the point home, saying, look, if a senator says the U.S. is at war, people are listening. It's serious.
And Carlson, Bannon too, they kept bringing up Iraq.
Constantly. Arguing the public was never told the truth about it. Citing those awful numbers, 8,000 soldiers killed, 500 injured, $9 trillion in losses. Their point being, you need the real story before you even think about another war.
And while this rhetoric is escalating, you have actual intelligence assessments saying something quite different.
Exactly. Which brings us to Tulsi Gabbard. In her role as Director of National Intelligence, she gave a very clear assessment to the Senate. This was back on March 25th, 2025.
What did she say specifically?
She stated, quote, "The intelligence community, IC, continues to assess that Iran is not building a nuclear weapon, and Supreme Leader Khamenei has not authorized the nuclear weapons program that he suspended in 2003. Pretty unambiguous.
Which directly contradicts the patience running out kind of talk.
Completely. And it makes it even more notable that she apparently wasn't invited to that key Camp David meeting about Iran. And of course, Trump publicly just dismissed her views.
So you have the DNI assessment being sidelined, seemingly, and then you have VP J.D. Vance stepping in to try and justify Trump's new, harder line.
Right, with that very long tweet. He was making these claims about Iran's uranium enrichment and civilian nuclear power. And he asserted that the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, said Iran had violated non-proliferation policy.
Okay, but how does that stack up against what the IAEA actually said?
Well, this is where it gets tricky and why details matter so much. Vance's claims. They seem to directly clash with statements from the IAEA Director General himself, Rafael Grossi.
What did Grossi say?
He told CNN quite clearly there's no evidence Iran is currently moving towards nuclear weapons. And the official IAEA report backed that up, finding no reliable indication of any active secret organized nuclear program.
So Vance's tweet wasn't quite reflecting the full picture from the agency he cited?
It seems not. And it's so important here to make that distinction, the one the IAEA makes, between enriching uranium for civilian power, which, provides about 9% of the world's energy, used in hundreds of plants globally.
Totally legitimate under international agreements.
Right. Versus enriching it to weapons-grade levels. They're not the same thing. And that nuance seems to get lost in some of the political talk. Getting that difference right is crucial for you, the listener, to understand what's really going on.
It's not just chatter among pundits either. There's actual legislative pushback happening.
Yeah, you've got this bipartisan effort. Yeah. Republican Thomas Massey from Kentucky, Democrat Ro Khanna from California. They're planning a joint war powers resolution.
The goal being
to basically assert Congress's authority and prevent the U.S. from getting drawn into a war with Iran without proper approval. Khanna was pretty direct, challenging the neoconservatives to actually go on record. So this cuts across party lines.
Which brings us neatly to this idea of the unseen hand, doesn't it? The so-called war lobby, or the neoconservatives.
Exactly. Trump built so much of his initial appeal on fighting this deep state or war lobby. But the interpretation now, looking at this Iran shift, is that maybe, just maybe, he's succumbed to their influence after all.
So let's define terms a bit. When people say neoconservatives in this context, what do they generally mean?
Well, typically it refers to a strain in U.S. foreign policy thinking, really prominent since maybe the 1960s onwards. They tend to advocate for a more assertive, interventionist U.S. role in the world.
Based on what kind of belief?
Often it's this idea that war can restore peace, or that it's America's duty, almost, to intervene, reshape things. They're often seen as having significant clout in, let's call it, the war and oil trade circles.
And tied into this, you often hear discussions, especially in U.S. media commentary, about Israeli influence.
Yes, that's a recurring theme. The viewpoint often expressed is that the Israeli lobby has America in its grip, essentially. That its strategic aims tend to become Washington's aims.
That Ted Cruz comment to Tucker Carlson comes back here too, doesn't it?
It does. His admission, however brief, that yes, Israel does engage in spying on the U.S., certainly added fuel to that particular discussion.
So when you put all these pieces together, the neoconservative influence, the lobby discussions, it paints a picture, for some, of powerful unelected forces really driving policy.
And that even presidents might feel compelled to, well, surrender to those forces as the narrative goes, which could lead, potentially, to that breakdown of international norms we talked about, that world of militias idea where power politics trumps law.
Okay, so let's circle back to the absolute core of this whole controversy. Iran's actual nuclear ambitions. Let's just nail down the facts as reported by intelligence.
Right. Fact check time. We have the assessment from DNI Tulsi Gabbard. We have the official statements from the IAEA. Both consistently emphasize there is no current evidence Iran is building a nuclear bomb.
No active weapons program, they found.
Correct. No secret weapons program has been reliably indicated. And again, that crucial distinction. Enriching uranium for energy, legitimate, widespread globally, is not the same as enriching for a weapon.
Which really raises the question, what's the justification for aggressive action now based on a threat that intelligence says isn't immediate and might not even happen for years, if ever?
It feels disproportionate, doesn't it? And it brings up uncomfortable echoes of the past, like Russia's justification for invading Ukraine based on future NATO threats, or obviously the WMD claims before the Iraq War, claims that turned out to be false.
And speaking of consistent narratives about Iran's threat, we can't not mention Benjamin Netanyahu.
Why, yes. His predictions have been, well, memorable. That 2012 UN speech with the cartoon bomb chart.
Claiming Iran would have a bomb in a year. That definitely went viral.
And he's kept up variations on that theme for years, often with shifting timelines, warning about how close Iran supposedly is.
What's he saying more recently, according to the sources?
Well, his public statements now seem pretty focused. He said he trusts Trump specifically for regime change in Iran, not for peace talks. That's quite telling.
And he's linked Israel's survival to the U.S.
Very directly, stating that Israel's very existence won't survive without that solid U.S. backing. For many analysts, this clearly signals his strategic priority, ensuring continued, strong U.S. alignment, potentially including military action against Iran.
This connects to another thread we touched on, this idea of Israel's maybe perceived desperation. That Washington Post report was pretty stunning.
It really was. An assessment apparently from within Israel itself suggesting their own missile defenses could only hold out against a full-on Iranian attack for maybe 10 to 12 days.
Just 10 to 12 days, that seems short, given the usual perception of their capabilities.
It does. And then you had those reports, mainly from Russian TV, it seems, alleging successful attacks on key Israeli sites, Mossad HQ, the Rafael Defense Complex, Haifa Port. Now, verification is hard, but the reports themselves add to the picture.
So how do people connect these dots?
Well, when you take the assessment of limited endurance, plus these alleged attacks, some analysts argue it points towards Israel feeling increasingly desperate. Desperate enough, perhaps, to actively push the U.S. towards intervening more directly and forcefully.
It forces you to ask a tough question, though.
Which is?
Why would a nation, usually seen as a regional military powerhouse, feel it can only fight in supposedly isolated Iran for less than 2 weeks on its own? It makes you reconsider the dynamics, maybe the motivations beyond just the nuclear issue.
Absolutely. It suggests there might be more complex calculations happening than just the public narratives led on.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground. Trump's shift, the internal dissent, the intelligence versus rhetoric, the role of neoconservatives, the nuclear specifics, Israel's position. What does this all mean for you, the listener, trying to make sense of it?
Well, I think first and foremost, it just underscores how incredibly complex this information landscape is.
Yeah.
And how easily facts, or maybe half facts, can be spun or, frankly, misconstrued by influential figures. Look at the Vance tweet versus the IAEA's actual statements.
Right. It's not just about finding information anymore. It's about vetting it constantly.
Exactly. So for anyone trying to navigate this stuff, really understanding those nuances we talked about, like the difference between enrichment for power and enrichment for bombs, or knowing what the intelligence agencies actually assess versus what politicians claim, it's not just helpful, it's pretty essential.
This whole situation seems to show how resilient certain narratives can be, even when the intelligence doesn't quite line up.
It really does. And it leads to this interesting idea, almost like a political demonetization that some sources mention.
What do they mean by that?
The idea that Trump, even with this major policy shift that seems to contradict his base's anti-war stance, has somehow demonetized his supporters.
Yeah.
They might be unhappy, they might grumble, but they seem to find new reasons, new justifications to stick with him, almost becoming, as one source put it rather harshly, slaves to the politics rather than the principles.
It really makes you question what consistency even means for a leader anymore, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. And that kind of leaves us, and you listening, with a final, maybe provocative thought to chew on.
Okay, let's hear it.
If powerful leaders can seem to just contradict themselves or ignore their own intelligence agencies, if they can redefine facts or walk away from long-held commitments, what does that actually mean for us, for the informed citizen?
How do we hold anyone accountable?
Right. How can we, the public, make sure our interests are genuinely being represented when information itself feels like it's become the battlefield? What's the real measure of a leader's consistency in a world like that?
That's definitely something to think about long after this deep dive ends.